Hello and welcome to our Future Female Forward special. Bridging the gender gap and cooperation on women's empowerment is a key pillar of the India-US relationship. So what next in this partnership? Joining us now to talk about this are three key US diplomats. US Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, Dr. Geeta Rao Gupta. Thank you very much, ma'am, for being with us. We also have Nancy Jackson, Deputy Assistant Secretary. Thank you very much for being with us. And USAID Deputy Administrator Anjali Kaur. Thank you once again for being with us. Ambassador Gupta, if I can begin with you. The US-India Alliance for Women's Empowerment, it was launched over 5 years ago. Give us a sense of how much has been achieved so far.
So we've actually reinvigorated that alliance this year and launched it this year with the focus on really increasing the number of women who are in jobs, in employment in the corporate sector, to increase women's entrepreneurship and their access to markets and finance and capital and credit and all the things that make entrepreneurs succeed, as well as to encourage women's participation in STEM occupations by increasing their skills in that area, but also their access to jobs. And the way that we thought it best to do that is to encourage public-private partnerships. So it's an alliance that brings together corporations in the private sector with the government and with the US government as well as the Indian government to try and achieve the goals to sort of accelerate women's economic empowerment. Because as I'm sure your viewers well know, that India is lagging behind in women's participation in the formal labor force. And there is a great priority that's been set by the Indian government to increase that number. It's somewhere currently at 37% and should be greater because the global average is 50% or higher in some countries. But there's some barriers that stand in the way. So the Alliance is looking at how to address those barriers by bringing together the talent, innovation, particular skills of different partners to sort of join hands and try and create the acceleration that's needed in this area.
All right. Nancy Jackson, if I were to ask you about some of the next steps that this alliance would like to take, or a message that you would have from the State Department in order to take this relationship forward for the next 5 years, what would those be?
Sure. So we just came from our first meeting, and it was quite exciting to hear all of the initiatives that so many of the companies, both American companies and Indian companies, are taking in this space. As Ambassador Rao Gupta noted, the alliance is really focused on collaboration, fostering collaboration across private and public sector, bringing in universities, philanthropy, civic organizations, and having us all work together to really tackle the challenges and barriers that women face to full participation in the workforce. So we're working with companies like Mahindra that are taking advantage of new technologies to actually lower the barriers to women finding jobs. So how do we bring in more women into the workforce? Hiring, but that's not enough. How do we retain women in workforce? How do we encourage and mentor them and support them through their job growth to see them as the next leaders in the future? And how do we tap the many, many women who are living in rural communities with small rural-based enterprises that women own? How do we connect them to the broader supply chains so that they're not forgotten and they're included in the economy? So I think as we go forward, you're going to see a lot more in that space, and I think we're all really excited by what we heard today.
Right. Anjali Kaur, if I were to ask you, when it comes to making investments in order to bridge the gender gap, when it comes to creating awareness among women about the jobs, the opportunities that are there in order to make sure that women have better access to credit, because studies have shown that women entrepreneurs don't have equal access to finance as men do, for that matter. What is USAID doing in that direction?
Yeah, a really good question. So I want to first highlight what my colleagues had said is that there is systemic barriers, foundational barriers that keep women from the formal economy. Why should women be in the formal economy? Because that's where you actually get a dignified wage. That's where you have safety nets. That's where you're able to live your full life in terms of a working life, right? And so in order to have access to the formal economy, you now need market linkages. You need financial literacy. You need access to credit. You need access to networking and mentorship. You also need access to being able to have childcare. And these are elements that not only women need in India, but women entrepreneurs and male entrepreneurs need that globally. So this is what we're trying to provide through the Alliance and through our work at USAID specifically. And so what do? We've got some great examples of the work that we're trying to do. One is that, our programs have evolved over history. We've evolved as we've seen the needs of women change and as we've learned ourselves. One of the first things that we did through the Revive Alliance was provide returnable grants to women. And so the idea of returnable grants is being able to provide women with these loans that are able to be used as seed money, be able to use for small business needs. And what we found is an 85% return rate. That is telling you, one, that they're capable, but it's also telling you that this is a great investment. So the evolution went from doing that to working with a more formal institution, right? Like Kotak Mahindra Bank. And so we went from providing returnable grants in a small scale to Kotak Mahindra Bank doing a $50 million loan that we have then been able to provide to women to say, use these for your businesses. We know you're good for the money. We know we're going to get these loans returned. And now you've established credit formally with a viable institution. And now that $50 million is turning into $200 million that we, together with the International Development Finance Corporation and Kotak Mahindra Bank, are doing. This is just one great example of how we can make credit accessible and what that does for women's dreams, aspirations, and livelihoods.
Right. So, Anjali Kaur, would there be certain figures that you could give us about the kind of investments that you are trying to make, either USAID is trying to make itself or is trying to garner and generate through private institutions by certain enabling policies for women empowerment, for women entrepreneurs over the next 2 to 3 years?
I mean, if I talk about investments, I think about what's left on the table, right? What is left on the table when you have a small percentage of women that are not in the formal economy? So how do we raise what Ambassador Gupta said from 37% to being able to reach at least 50% of what's happening across the globe? I think about what's left on the table in terms of the money that could be reached. We are saying $2.9 trillion is capable of being achieved if women are part of the formal economy. These are the goals that we've set out, but also the goals of how do women access services more broadly. This is what's allowing them, being a part of the formal economy allows them to access healthcare. So all of a sudden you have a healthier workforce, but you also have a healthier population. You have their children going to school, so you have broader education. Those are our goals right now, is being able to rise all boats together. And we believe that happens when you have more women accessing the formal economy with jobs that allow them to have a dignified wage.
Right. Ambassador Gupta, what I'd like to ask you, you're here also to have conversations on gender-based violence. Give us a sense of any concerns that you have that you are looking to communicate to the Indian government about areas that we need to work on urgently.
So this is an issue that many countries face, is that women experience violence within the home, in the workplace, on the street, in times of war, in times of peace. It's a reality in women's lives across the globe, and certainly in India as well. And what I'm trying to do during my visit here this time is to focus attention in particular on safety in transportation and in transit to and from work, or in whatever women's daily activities are, that they should feel safe to use public transportation, and that the government owes them that. And so there's a lot of experimentation that's going on in India right now in trying to figure out what might be solutions to increase women's safety. And we're here to learn from those, to listen to some of what of those solutions might be, and to also bring to partners both within local governments, within state governments, municipalities, as well as to the national government, some of what we have learned through my office from other countries and cities within the US and the experiments that are being tried there. So it's really to have a dialogue and a conversation to think about what are the solutions out there that can be implemented. In addition to that, we will also be having a conversation about gender-based violence overall. I know there was the countries talking about the incident that recently happened in Kolkata, and which is a horrific incident and very upsetting to hear about. But what can be done with the legislation that already exists, I think the gap is often in enforcement, as it is often in many countries around the world. But there's also a normative context, right? It's somehow violence against women is accepted. How should that norm change? So it's good to see that people are stepping out on the streets and asking for solutions, because I think that's an important step forward. So I hope that we can, through this conversation, bring to the table some of what evidence has shown works in terms of prevention, in terms of services, in terms of accountability and justice systems, law enforcement that can help address this issue.
You spoke about the RG Kaur rape case, which has taken place in Kolkata, a very gruesome case which is making national headlines. We've come a long way. Over the last 10 years, we've seen some very brutal crimes against women and children as well. There is debate about how much we've come from the Nirbhaya case, which took place in India over 10 years ago. Where do you think we are going wrong? Because every time there is a case like this, it is said that the laws are already there. It is about how you implement them. It is how you create awareness. Where do you think the gap is when it comes to preventing such crimes in India?
I think that answer should come from the Indian people. And I think the fact that people are raising their voices and asking for solutions is extremely important. I do think that the basic legal framework does exist, but there's a lot of education that needs to happen within the judicial system, within the law enforcement mechanisms, because I think the gap invariably in most countries in the world that have the laws, the gap is in the enforcement and in the justice and accountability. And doing that in a way that's survivor-centered, so that you're thinking about the woman who's been through that trauma and what's the best way to address her needs in a way that she needs it addressed, right? There are some models that we have evidence of that work. It's a question of being able to implement them. So it takes investment, it takes resources, it takes a national conversation, which unfortunately often occurs only when there is a horrific incident. But it's a conversation that needs to happen in a continuous way.
All right, on that thought, we'll have to take a break, but don't go anywhere. This special conversation continues on the other side. Welcome back. You're watching our Future Female Forward special. Joining us today are Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, Dr. Geeta Rao Gupta. Also joining us is Nancy Jackson, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department, and USAID Deputy Administrator Anjali Kaur. Nancy Jackson, if I were to ask you about women empowerment and bridging the gender gap becoming a foreign policy objective between the US and India, what is the Biden administration's message? I know we're heading into US elections, but going forward, do you expect policies around industry, around national security, around defense, cooperation in technology, all of them to be centered somewhere around a mandate for women inclusion? Absolutely.
So, you know, the U.S.-India relationship is very broad and very deep, but it is anchored in, and its foundation really lies in the people-to-people ties between our two countries. And a critical component of that people-to-people ties is really women, and empowering women, the other 50% of our workforce, the other 50% of our societies. How do we lift them up and ensure equal access? And so as we think about our priorities in this space, I would focus on a number of things, many of which we've talked about already and that the Alliance is focused on. How do we help improve the number of women that are entering the workforce so that there is more equal gender representation in the workforce? How do we advance and support women entrepreneurs and have them able to skill up and expand their own businesses to provide more for their families? How do we give them access to affordable credit? How do we break down the barriers that prevent them from not only entering the workforce but succeeding in the workforce? What are the good policies and practices that corporations have that can be amplified and shared? Whether it's gender equality, whether it's equal pay for work, whether it's very supportive networks that allow for better work-life balance. How can we address the on the other side, the discriminatory practices that we also see, and remove those. How do we help educate and skill and upskill women to move them from lower wage jobs to more higher skilled jobs, particularly as we think about the jobs in the future, whether it's STEM, whether it's new technologies? How do we ensure that the jobs of the future are accessible to women? So I think our mandate and our focus and our priority is quite broad and quite large, but it will remain a mainstay and a critical component of the U.S.-India relationship.
Right. You spoke about STEM. Over the last 2 years, both the countries are working very closely together on skilling women in STEM. Are there other sectors that you would now be focusing on? And how do you further expect cooperation from the private sector in helping you in this US-India Women Alliance and taking it forward?
Excellent question. As Ambassador Rao Gupta mentioned, one of the 3 priorities we've set for the Alliance this year is really focusing on women and girls in STEM and trying to encourage women and girls at an early age to be excited about STEM, not just in terms of education, but then taking that education and applying it in the workforce. So one of our anchor partners for the Alliance is Johns Hopkins University. And what Johns Hopkins University is doing is trying to encourage graduates in STEM degrees to actually stay in the research and development element of STEM fields. Because what we see is that women, while they are very well represented in terms of education, they're not as well represented in research and development and in the workforce. And if we can get more women in research and development in STEM fields, we're really setting them up to be the leaders of the future in those areas. We also have, for example, Boeing, another Alliance member, that is really focused on getting girls excited about STEM. So they're building STEM labs in schools across this country. They're also supporting women to become pilots through pilot training. So this will help women enter the workforce in aviation sector. I think there's just tons of great work. Renew, another partner of ours, an Indian company, is collaborating with others and making a commitment to train women to work in solar technology. So the green economy and climate change, big issues for the future and really huge potential in terms of jobs. We want to make sure women are not isolated from that. And so having Renew train women as solar technicians opens a whole new avenue for more upskilling and better jobs for women.
Can I just add to that all of what Nancy just mentioned are central pillars of the first ever U.S. Global Women's Economic Security Strategy that President Biden and Secretary Blinken introduced. It's an interagency effort to try and advance women's economic empowerment. And so under the rubric of that strategy, Vice President Harris actually introduced an initiative called the Women in Sustainable Economies Initiative, which is really to increase women's representation in the green economy and the blue economy. And so it's part of what we're doing through this alliance is really advancing the US strategy and some of these initiatives that have precedential sort of leadership.
Right. So we've really come towards the end of our interview. But I would like to ask each one of you one question. Of course, it's a big moment in India-US ties, but one of the reasons why we're watching this election very closely in the United States is because you have an Indian American on the ballot. How can we let you go without asking you this question? So let me begin with Anjali Kaur. So Anjali, being a woman, being a successful businesswoman, reaching to a big position in the government, as you've done yourself, how do you see Kamala Harris's place on the ballot? What does it really mean to Indian Americans in the United States and women in America?
Great question. One, I think the globe is always excited when women participate in politics. So civic participation and increased civic participation by women, regardless of country, is important. And for us, it's an advancement. It's a step forward. So first of all, we're happy to see more women participate, and we're happy to see the first Black and Indian woman be on a major party ticket. For me, personally, and I think for all of us, it's this notion of breaking barriers. It's creating history in the moment. It's being able to say, I'm able to say, I see someone like me on the ballot, regardless of party. And I know that a number of Indians are saying that, especially young Indian women are saying that. This is what's possible. And I think this is what we're seeing from this ballot right now, and what we're seeing with Kamala Harris being on the ticket is breaking of traditions, charting a new path, thinking about what's possible for women in every single country, and what's possible regardless if you're a minority or not. And so that's what's exciting, regardless of what the outcome is.
Right. Nancy Jackson, what does it mean to you?
So I think it's always historic when a woman, particularly a woman of color, is leading a presidential campaign in the U.S. I mean, everything that Anjali said, I would completely agree with. I might just add, though, for your audience, as we think about kind of the U.S.-India relationship, I just want to underscore one point, which is this relationship transcends politics. It is strong bipartisan support in our Congress, across our parties, and I see that only continuing. And so I'm very excited about the future for the relationship.
Right. Ambassador Gupta, my final word to you. What does it mean for Indian Americans? Yes, it is a strong group in the United States, but to have Kamala Harris on the ballot, what's the message for both nations?
So I'll tell you how my daughter feels. My daughter was born in this country, raised in the US, and she's excited. But as Nancy said, it's the excitement is because you have a black Indian woman who is on a major party ticket. Women's leadership, regardless in whichever arena, whether it's civic leadership, political leadership, in business, is a critical component of women's empowerment overall. And so we've seen over the years that the percentage of women participating in politics has been increasing globally. In the past few years, it's begun to, the rate of growth of that trend has dropped some, and that's very worrisome. So given that context, this is particularly exciting.
All right, wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Our initiative, Future Female Forward, Ambassador Gupta, Nancy Jackson, Anjali Kaur, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
That's all we have the time for on this special broadcast. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
For more news and updates, all you need to do is follow CNBC TV18 on all of our digital platforms.